Joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Washington, D.C., Ali Alfoneh, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Paul Pillar, director of studies at the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, and Ash Jain, visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In New York, New York, Austin Long, professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, and with us in studio here in Toronto, Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T. And I want to thank everybody, Janice, nice to see you again, and everybody in Points Beyond for joining us for our conversation about Iran tonight. And I want to start by just reading something that the Associated Press reported on a few days ago to set up our discussion this evening. The talks in Istanbul on Saturday saw the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany sitting at the same table with Iran. Knowing the road ahead is tough, both sides focused on what they said was the positive tone of the talks, in contrast to the previous round 14 months ago. In a rare show of unity, Iran and the world's big powers on Saturday hailed their first nuclear meeting in more than a year as a key step towards further negotiations meant to ease international fears that Tehran may weaponize its nuclear program. The one concrete reflection of progress was an agreement to meet again on May 23rd in Baghdad, a venue put forward by Iran. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, who formally led the talks on behalf of the six powers, called the meeting, quote, constructive and useful. Iranian chief negotiator Saeed Jalili said the talks made, quote, some progress, but he acknowledged some points of difference. And that's where I want to start. So, Ali Alfoneh, perhaps I can get you to start us off here. Coming out of the weekend meeting, what are those still main points of difference yet to be hammered out?
To be quite honest, I'm not so terribly impressed by the results of the first round of the negotiations. What we have heard is only that these two parties are content and satisfied, but we don't know what they are satisfied about. And to be quite honest with you, if the only thing that they agree upon is to meet again next time in Baghdad is the only result of this round of talks, that is a very, very meager result. To me, it seems that the Islamic Republic is just continuing the good old show of delaying and prolonging negotiations and hoping that as long as Iran continues negotiations, futile negotiations with absolutely no results, there would be no bombing campaigns against Iran's nuclear facilities. So the winner in this round of negotiations most certainly is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and certainly not any members of the 5+1 group.
Let me ask Paul to pick up on that. Do you agree that just an agreement to meet again is not progress enough for these talks?
No, I don't agree. I mean, given the normal course of international diplomacy and given the fact that these parties had not even sat down with each other for over a year, I think it would be unreasonable to expect anything more than an agreement to continue the process. We've had this expectation build up that people would come away from Istanbul with some kind of signed, sealed agreement. That would be totally unrealistic. So I think the positive tone of the description of the talks from both sides is appropriate.
Ash Jain, you want to break the tie here?
Yeah, I think the way I would see it is from the Iranian perspective, their interest is simply to engage in a process of negotiations, which, as Ali pointed out, would lower the political temperature that's taking place these days to try to ensure that the Israelis have no political atmosphere in which they could conduct a military strike. And at the same time, I think the Iranians are looking for a alleviation of these economic sanctions. They certainly don't want to see any new sanctions imposed. They'd like to get some of the pressure taken off from the existing sanctions that are being tightened and squeezing the Iranian economy day by day. So I think the Iranians are simply looking for some kind of improved atmosphere to try to loosen the tensions and give the Iranians more time to continue the technological advances that they're seeking to make as they pursue a nuclear weapons capability. I mean, from their perspective, they see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just a matter of time. They need a little bit more time before they will have achieved some kind of nuclear breakthrough.
Well, you've said until they achieve the nuclear weapons capability that they want, and of course that's very much up for debate, which we will get to as we go along. But I do want Austin Long to pick up on your comment about sanctions. And Austin, I wonder if you could help us understand what sanctions are biting the most and hurting Iran the most at the moment.
The most recent rounds of sanctions over the past 6 months are what's really biting. You've got restrictions on oil. You've had restrictions from using the international SWIFT banking system. You have more restrictions on oil set to come online relatively soon. So it's these sanctions that are relatively recent that I think are really starting to tell on the Iranian economy.
And Janice, based on your understanding of things, what concessions are America and the rest of the world going to need to see from Iran before they ease up on those sanctions?
So that's hotly debated, and there's broadly two positions. One strong argument is that, and this is an old argument, that Iran has to agree not to enrich past 3.5%, which is what you need for medical isotopes. So
3.5% for medical isotopes.
That's right. And anything beyond that, and they're currently enriching at 20%, and it's that jump from the 3.5% to the 20%. That's the hard part. Going up after that is not as difficult. So Iran would have to formally renounce and allow verification. That's the more maximal demand. The more minimal demand, and this is, I think, interesting, is that Iran cease burying its, particularly at Fordo, because it is burying its nuclear installation so deep underground that it requires very sophisticated bunker-busting bombs to take those out. That is what Israel does not have. And so Israel's timeline with respect to when this is no longer tolerable is different from the U.S. timeline. For the U.S., it's when they get clear evidence that Iran has really made a decision to weaponize. For Israel, it's just short of when they no longer have the capacity to take out installations under the ground. If you want to slow this down and you're Iran, you stop burying.
Okay, lots of stuff to unpack there, which we'll do over the course of our hour tonight. Ali, let me bring you in on this issue. We've seen, we have heard how the sanctions are hurting Iran. Diplomatically, Iran has lost some influence in the region. Hamas seems to be less friendly these days. Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, seems to be less friendly these days. Their closest ally, obviously Syria, is in a great deal of difficulty these days. Does all of that, in your view, put more pressure on Iran to come to some positive conclusion at these negotiations?
You are perfectly right in describing Iran as a very, very isolated state. Iran has never been as isolated in its post-revolution history as the case is today. Hamas is certainly defecting from Iran's camp, particularly because of different views on developments in Syria. And Hezbollah, we have seen Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah General Secretary, making the statement that should Iran's nuclear installations, contrary to expectation, be bombarded by Israel, Hezbollah's reaction would be decided in Lebanon and not in Tehran. That, of course, could be interpreted as a way that Hezbollah is going to make its own decisions and not listen to Tehran. So is Tehran trying to comply with the UN regime and non-proliferation as a consequence of this? I certainly believe that Iran would like to give the impression of cooperation, but in reality, prolonging the negotiations in order to advance the program so much that it can get very, very close to the phase of weaponization. That would put Iran in a very, very good negotiation position with the 5+1 group. And the case seems to be that the Islamic Republic, for now at least, is very successful. The Obama administration here in Washington wants to believe that negotiations are successful, but of course I do not see any proof of that. And the European partners of the United States also would want to believe that negotiations and diplomacy with Iran is producing some results.
Let me get Paul on
But I
this part
certainly
of it.
believe that there is a difference between what we want to see and what we want to believe and what the realities are.
Okay, Paul, do you similarly see an isolated Iran here, perhaps more so than it's been in some time?
You're correct, Steve, that the dynamics of what we call the Arab Spring have not exactly worked in Iran's favor. In fact, it's gone the other way, particularly with regard to the regime of Assad in Syria, seemingly at the end of its existence, maybe. So yes, that does help the isolation. Now, with regard to the how time works either in favor of this side or in favor of the other side, I'd have to disagree with Ali on that. We hear a lot of talk about Iran just dragging things out. Well, time is not working on their side the way the sanctions have worked, and as Austin pointed out, especially this latest round, has been pinching very hard. Time, if anything, is on the side of the P5+1 with regard to how the sanctions are working. So I don't see this at all as Iran trying simply to drag a process out and not wanting an agreement.
Austin, maybe I can get you to follow up on that. Time's on whose side right now?
Well, time's working in a lot of different ways. I think in a sort of abstract way, Paul's right. The Western powers aren't really hurting in a way that Iran is. But Israel, as Janice mentioned, has really become extraordinarily nervous about the state of Iran's nuclear program. They're building up a stockpile of material that doesn't take very much additional work to enrich to weapons grade level. They're building a facility that's roughly 300 feet under a mountain. So that's the clock that's really ticking in this scenario, is at what point do the Israelis, if any, decide that they have to take military action before this builds up too much. So I think if it were not for that sort of ticking clock, Paul would be right. But I think you really have to take into account what the Israelis will do as they see their military option erode before their very eyes.
Ash Jane, let's focus on that a little bit. How do you think the Israeli government regards these talks that are currently ongoing?
Well, I think the Israelis have made it clear that they're very skeptical, certainly about this first round of talks. They would see it as the Iranians simply trying to buy time to delay any kind of potential military strike or even the sanctions regime that's been implemented. I think the Israelis are very concerned, as was just mentioned, about the progress, the technological progress that Iran continues to make day after day as it nears this near-term nuclear breakthrough. So I think from the Israeli perspective, they would like to see some kind of resolution that, if it were to succeed, would end up resulting in the Iranians making some kind of significant concession, a meaningful concession on their nuclear program. But the reality from their perspective is that it doesn't seem that that's coming anytime soon.
Janice, is it even possible to say, here's what the Israeli government thinks, given that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, all from different parties? This is a coalition government. They're all from different parties. Are they all on the same page on this?
Well, the Foreign Minister doesn't matter. Not unusual, frankly. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense think alike. They're wholly aligned.
Even though they're different parties?
Yes. Well, Barack really has no party because he's separated from his own party. He is the party. So they are aligned. But where the important difference is here, Steve, there is important differences between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense on the one hand, and the Chief of the General Staff and senior military and intelligence leaders. So that is a very live debate, and there are significant divisions there. What does matter is what they've told President Obama, and that it is this problem with, and I think it's really useful to separate that problem from the broader issue of enrichment and Iran's right to enrich under the NPT, which it certainly has a right to enrich.
Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yes, and it has a right under that treaty to enrich for peaceful purposes.
So medical isotopes
Medical
to
isotopes are peaceful. The 20%.
Nuclear power, keep the lights on?
That is
enriches
peaceful.
to what?
Well, that's not much more, frankly. Okay. So there's really no need to enrich at 20%. But separate that out from burying the installations underground, because it is that which is pushing the clock forward so rapidly.
Well,
so if we look to Baghdad, what am I looking for? And I don't think it will be public. Some agreement to visibly stop burying, which can be monitored externally. That would be a significant concession.
Paul Pillar, let's dive a little deeper on this and we'll get you started off, because obviously one of the things that we need to understand is what we think we know about an Iranian decision to build a nuclear weapon. How much do we know about whether or not that government has made that decision yet?
Well, the judgment of the U.S. intelligence communities, as stated publicly by the U.S. Intelligence Director, General Clapper, is, so far as we know, they have not made that decision. There clearly has been an interest for a long time on the part of the Iranians, an interest in weaponizing their nuclear material. We do know that they have, in the past, works specifically on weapons design and weaponization. The IAEA continues to raise some questions that need to be answered. But as for actually a decision to go ahead and build a bomb, so far as we know, that's something that hasn't to date been done, and the Iranians are still keeping their options open.
Austin Long, what's your understanding of that?
I agree 100% with Paul. The Iranians, clearly in the intelligence community, I think is right on this, wants the option on a bomb. They have not made the decision whether to exercise that option. The United States, I think, as was alluded to a little earlier by Janice, can probably live, at least in the near term, with an Iranian option because we believe we have the ability to get sufficient warning and have sufficient military power to act at that point. That's where we differ from the Israelis in that they see that they may not have this option in 6 months or a year.
Ash, I don't want to be a smart aleck here, but the last time that an intelligence service leader said, we got a slam dunk on intelligence in this part of the world, the outcome wasn't too good. How sure are Americans of the intelligence that suggests the Iranians haven't made a decision yet on this?
Right, and I think that's what's tricky because when you're talking about intent, and in this case we're talking about the Iranian intent as to whether or not they want to proceed to build a nuclear weapon, it's difficult sitting thousands of miles away to get into the minds of the leaders of the regime and to know what they're really thinking. You can only judge their intent by what we see, by what we pick up, and by the actions that they're taking. And I think Paul is right. We're not seeing at this point that the Iranians have demonstrated a decision to go ahead and build an actual nuclear weapon, but they're taking all of the steps necessary to perfect the technology to build a bomb. They're enriching uranium and have been for the last several years to the creeping up to the level and the technological sophistication required if they were to decide to build a bomb. And of course, they're engaging in all these weaponization and ballistic missile delivery systems. So I think all indications are that the Iranians are interested in a bomb. They're waiting perhaps until a moment in time when they've crossed several thresholds before they would make a decision to actually put all of the pieces together. And it makes sense. If you look at what the Iranians are trying to do, this is an ideologically motivated regime that has long sought to end Western interference in the Middle East. They've sought to challenge the very existence of Israel, and they've sought regional domination. So in order to achieve these kinds of sort of extremist foreign policy goals, the Iranians, they would see it as necessary to have a nuclear weapons capability as a deterrent, as a shield, essentially, to allow them to engage in a much more aggressive and provocative foreign policy.
Janice?
You know, this is the big question. How good is intelligence? It's only as good as your last failure. And in fact, intelligence analysts always overcorrect for the last failure. And that's part of, I think, the intense debate. What's different here is that the IAEA does have inspectors on the ground. That was not true in Iraq. Now, the IAEA inspectors have asked for access, and they have not been fully satisfied in getting access to the sites that they want. And they've repeatedly said there are unanswered questions, but nevertheless, they are on the ground, which should increase everybody's confidence in the quality of the intelligence. Secondly, there's what we call human intelligence, which in plain English means you listen in through technology and somebody says, let's go for this, let's build a bomb. There's no evidence that any intelligence service in the world has picked up that kind of conversation. So the real problem here is exactly as Ash just suggested, that it's entirely conceivable that Iran will go right up to the point. In other words, what you call that is breakthrough capability. It will have the capacity to move very rapidly from where it is to build a bomb.
But may not do it.
But may not do it. And that then leaves everybody, one, with a very short time to respond, should they decide to do it. And here's where I think the Obama administration is probably out on a limb. Recently, the president said an Iranian nuclear bomb is totally unacceptable. And then he went one step further. We will know when they make that decision. I don't think there's anyone who can say with certainty that if they go very, very close to the edge, but stop, that the American intelligence community will know.
Ali, everybody's trying to read the tea leaves on this, and I want to read one statement to you that Ayatollah Khamenei said in a letter. He said that holding nuclear arms is a sin as well as useless, harmful, and dangerous. What do you read into those comments?
Well, the regime propaganda is trying to use the so-called fatwa or religious edict of Ayatollah Khamenei to argue that Iran is not interested in achieving the nuclear bomb. But first of all, Mr. Khamenei is not even an Ayatollah. He is not in a position as a source of emulation, a Shia source of emulation, to issue fatwas. That is the first part of the problem. And secondly, historically, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, religion has been used as a political instrument. And whenever the regime leaders have found it expedient, they have changed their religious edicts. In other words, first they issue a religious edict, and whenever it is in the interest of the state to have a different point of view, they simply change it. Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the Islamic Republic, did that, and Mr. Khamenei tried actually to challenge one of the fatwas of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. And I am referring to the fatwa against Mr. Salman Rushdie, the British Indian author, that Mr. Khomeini wanted to kill, and Mr. Khamenei said that Mr. Khomeini's fatwa was not a real fatwa and he should be forgiven, particularly if Mr. Rushdie converts to Islam. In other words, we cannot put so much, I would say, trust in that kind of statements from Tehran, that if it is from a religious point of view prohibited, then Iran would not pursue that path.
Okay, I hear you, but Paul, come in on this as well. I mean, everybody, not everybody, so many people seem to be under the assumption that it's a fait accompli that the Iranians are trying to accumulate nuclear weapons right now. And yet here's Khamenei saying that they're useless, harmful, and dangerous. So what do you read into that?
The statement is significant not because some kind of religious edict is going to drive the eventual Iranian decisions about making or not making a bomb. Those decisions will be based on more prosaic, secular calculations of what is or is not in Iran's interest as the Iranian leadership sees it. The statement is significant by leaving the supreme leader an out in being able to sell to his own people and to his own regime some kind of deal with the P5+1 that rules out an Iranian nuclear weapon. He can say, look, we did not concede to the Western point of view. We are simply living up to our own standards and our own principles. But it's not going to be a religious diktat that determines the decision in the first place.
Austin, what do you think on that?
I think I agree with Paul in terms of the decision-making will be based on secular concerns, and a lot will depend on the geopolitics of any given time when Iran is looking at whether to exercise this option it's trying to develop. If it looks like exercising the option is going to invite military attack from the United States, it probably won't exercise it. If it looks like the United States is possibly gearing up for regime change, which is unlikely at present but might happen in the future, then exercising that option might be the thing to do. So I think Paul's right that it's not religion that's going to dictate this. It's going to be more prosaic geopolitics.
A quick follow-up. When you say unlikely at present for regime change, do I infer from that you mean if Barack Obama is the president after the November election, probably not, but that if Mitt Romney is, maybe yes?
Maybe not even as soon as that, but I mean, if you're thinking in terms of retaining a nuclear option, it was highly unlikely in the late 1990s the United States would invade with hundreds of thousands of troops to change the regime in Iraq, and a few years later that changed. So I think if you're being a prudent policymaker, even if this upcoming election doesn't decide things in that way, 1 in 4 or 8 or 12 years might. I mean, you have to think in sort of a longer game than the next election cycle. And bear in mind, the Iranians have been working on this nuclear option for, as you pointed out at the top of the show, more than a decade. They're playing a longer game here.
Gotcha. Janice?
Well, I actually take the fatwa more seriously than some of my colleagues from this perspective. This is not the first time that the Ayatollahs have said that nuclear weapons are haram, forbidden. And in fact, the little bit we know about the internal decision-making, and it's a little bit only, Steve, it was Ayatollah Khamenei who stopped the weaponization program. So I think what is fair to say here is there is a predisposition not to do this. A fatwa is, I understand the successor can challenge the fatwa, but it would not be easy for Khamenei to walk away from this. So what we see in a sense is a predisposition not to do this. Now, what could change? One, there's always the safety, in a sense, the what you need in your back pocket in case geopolitics changes. And the worrying part about that is you go very far up to the threshold because you're not certain about what the future holds. Secondly, if you look at the fate of Gaddafi,
the lesson there seems to be get him as fast as you can.
I mean, in some senses, one can argue that was a huge strategic error. He gave up nuclear weapons, and he ended up dead in a ditch. Yeah. That's not something that the Iranian leadership missed, frankly. It makes this conversation a lot more difficult than it otherwise might have been.
Ash, let me bring you in here by reading something that Stephen Ehrlinger wrote in the New York Times a few days ago. He reported that Washington is eager to take some of the urgency out of the Iranian confrontation and to reassure Israel that there is time for diplomacy and sanctions to work. In particular, in the next few months, Washington would like to ensure that Iran stops enriching uranium to 20%, ships out its existing stocks, and shuts down on downgrades its enrichment site at Fordo, which, because it is built inside a mountain, would be difficult to bomb. Here's the question. Unless inspectors are allowed in, how are the Americans and the Europeans going to be assured that Iran is not enriching past 20%?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the difficulties that we're going to face, and this will, I'm sure, be very much part of the negotiations if and when we get to that stage, because the Iranians could decide at some point to agree to some kind of commitment regarding the points that you just raised in some limited way, in which case the question of verification will very much be on the table. And so from the Iranian perspective, I think, again, they would try to do what they could to keep as much as their nuclear program on track as they can while trying to stave off some of these sanctions measures. And one way to do that would be to play a cat and mouse game with inspectors, as we've seen them do in the past. We certainly saw this happen under the Saddam Hussein regime. And so it wouldn't be unexpected to see the Iranians try to skirt any kind of limited commitment that they might try to make as part of this long or protracted negotiation. I think the question will be how much tolerance there will be from the Obama administration and from its European partners with regard to this kind of tactical game that the Iranians are likely to play. And whether or not it's going to come to a point where, because of the Israeli pressure and because simply the U.S. itself, I think, has made it clear the administration does not want to see Iran achieve these kinds of breakthroughs, that they'll have to put a stop to the negotiations track and then consider other alternatives.
Ali, help us understand this.
I just want to jump in real quick if I could.
Sure, go ahead. New York City, go ahead.
Fordo is under inspection. So the sites that the IAEA is currently asking for access to are sites like Parchin, which the Iranians say is a military facility that has nothing to do with the nuclear program. The site at Fordo, which is the one of concern, is inspected. Most recently, a report came out on it at the end of February. So we, as Janice, I think, alluded to earlier, the Iranians, once they're called on having a site, Fordo was originally not declared. The Western intelligence community picked it up. And once it was pointed out to them what they were doing, it's been under inspection. So you have to be careful when you talk about Iranians resisting inspections. They have obfuscated in some ways, but the critical sites, like Fordo, are currently under inspection.
And just on this point, to follow on what Austin just said, it's entirely conceivable that you can slow the clock down were Iran to agree to vigorous inspection of Fordo, because that is the issue that is driving Israeli decision-making. And were they satisfied that there was aggressive inspection of that one site, Iran would not have to renounce in the next couple of months any attempt to enrich. That's for the months following. What would break the deadlock right now, the rush to war, is if there were rigorous inspection of Fordo. That was critical.
But there was a reference, Ali, to this cat and mouse game that was played in Iraq that Saddam Hussein did do, and we saw what the result of all of that was. How far do you think the Iranians, or how much cat and mouse game playing vis-a-vis inspections do you think the Iranians are up to knowing that they saw what happened in the neighborhood?
Well, I believe that the Islamic Republic systematically overestimates its abilities to fool the entire world. And sometimes even I agree with them, because they have managed to do very, very well. The regime in Tehran fundamentally believes that the United States is a declining world empire. They systematically depict the United States as the British Empire after the end of World War II. They believe that European powers are not as important as they were before. They believe, sometimes wrongly, that Russia and China are behind them, despite the fact that most of the time we have seen Russia betraying Tehran. They still believe that Russia and China, because of their animosity towards the West, are ready to help Iran at critical moments. And they also do not see such a great willingness in Washington to use military force in order to stop Iran's nuclear program. And therefore, they absolutely see no reason to cooperate, particularly after the realities that the United States is facing in Afghanistan and Iraq. The appetite for war in Washington is not very big. The public opinion would be against it. And Iranian leaders also read newspapers published in this country. And therefore, they can allow themselves to take this kind of liberties and press the United States ever more systematically than before. And also, let me lastly say this, that those making the decisions in Tehran are no longer people who were taking the strategic decisions in the 1980s and early 1990s. It is no longer grand ayatollahs. It is no longer people like Mr. Khamenei or other clerics taking the decisions. We see the rise of a new generation of Revolutionary Guards officers whose formative years of youth were spent during the Iran-Iraq war. So the only language that they understand is the language of force. And this is one of the troubles that we have. They dominate Iran, and if they do not see the United States willing to use force in order to stop Iran's nuclear program, they certainly see no reason to cooperate.
Paul, you want to follow up on that?
I think it's very misleading to talk about cat and mouse games and making comparable comparisons to Iraq. The situations are entirely different. Saddam Hussein did not have active weapons programs, but he wanted his internal and external opponents to believe that he did. Iran, quite by contrast, brags about its nuclear program, asserts repeatedly that it is peaceful. It has every interest in being open about it, and as Austin mentioned, they are open about it even in this facility that is of most concern, the buried one at Fordo. And lest we forget, when the inspectors were kicked out of Iraq, it wasn't Saddam Hussein that did it, it was the United States government who did it. From the point of view of the Iranians, they have plenty of reason to agree to intrusive inspections to try to demonstrate exactly what they've been asserting all along. What they would not be comfortable with is holding hostage to the prospect of an Israeli or a United States military attack against their facilities. So when it comes to something like Fordo, they have lots of reason not to close it down entirely and to agree only to have facilities that are above ground where they can very conveniently be bombed. They have a much greater reason to continue to be forthcoming with regard to things like inspections at Fordo.
Okay, to that end, I'd like to play some tape right now, and then Ash, I'll ask you to comment first coming out of this. This is from the American Sunday morning program Face the Nation. Leon Panetta, the Defense Secretary of the United States, talking about some of these issues that we've been engaged in here tonight. Roll tape, please.
I think the pressure of the sanctions, I think the pressure of diplomatic pressures from everywhere, Europe, the United States, elsewhere, is working to put pressure on them, to make them understand that they cannot continue to do what they're doing. Are they trying to develop a nuclear weapon? No, but we know that they're trying to develop a nuclear capability, and that's what concerns us. And our red line to Iran is do not develop a nuclear weapon. That's a red line for us.
Ash, I'd like you to start us off on some discussion about this so-called red line, because different countries have different red lines. And I wonder if you could help us understand, where's America's red line versus Israel's red line? Are they the same red line?
Yeah, I think the statement that Secretary Panetta just made points to a potential difference in how to read where that red line is. He's drawing the distinction between this nuclear weapons acquisition and a nuclear capability, suggesting that the United States is prepared to live with some kind of breakout capability, but would act, presumably, if Iran went to the point of achieving or acquiring an actual nuclear weapon. I think the Israelis would see that as dangerous and unsustainable because, as we've talked about earlier, the time within which a country like Iran could go from a breakthrough, from a capability to an actual nuclear weapon could be very short. We could be talking about a matter of weeks, in which case it would be too late to prevent the actual breakthrough from occurring by the time the international community might know about it. And so I think that's a point of difference between the United States and Israel. It's probably what's causing Israel to be especially concerned as we enter this sort of phase of negotiations, because day by day the Iranians are slowly getting closer and closer to this breakout capability. The Israelis have, I think they're looking at the entire Iranian issue from a perspective that we have to be a little bit more attuned to. I mean, in the sense that from their perspective, they're sitting within striking range of Iranian missiles. They're facing a regime that has said many, many times that Israel has no right to exist, should be wiped off the face of the map, and they are looking at banking their entire future on Iranian rationality, if in fact the Iranians achieve a nuclear weapons capability. So I think even if there's a small chance, a very small chance, that the Iranians might one day actually use a nuclear weapon, the Israelis are not prepared to live, with some kind of risk that at some time in the future a regime might decide to pull the trigger.
Can I get Austin and forgive me? Let me get Austin and Janice on this issue of whether America and Israel have different red lines on this. Austin, you first.
Sure, I think they absolutely do, and we've sort of touched on the reasons why, but a fundamental reason is the difference in military capability. The United States looks at Fordo and thinks, boy, that's going to be really tough, but we have B-2 bombers that can carry these newly developed 30,000-pound bunker busters. It might be hard, but eventually we can deliver enough ordnance to destroy that target. So we can wait. We don't face a vanishing military window of opportunity. The Israelis, whose sort of longest range strike aircraft is an F-15, can carry a 5,000-pound bomb. They look at Fordo and think that might be a bridge too far. So I think that's what's really driven the differences in red lines. The U.S. doesn't see this vanishing window in the way the Israelis do, and I think the timing of this crisis indicates that. The Iranians have had a nuclear program for a decade. The Israelis had a really robust military option against facilities that were not very deeply buried or were above ground. So while they would say things occasionally about taking military action, they wouldn't, because they weren't under time pressure. Fordo centrifuges began to be installed last fall, and that's exactly when this crisis really escalated. So I think it's that difference in military capability that fundamentally determines a lot of the difference in red lines.
I agree wholly with Austin. If you just take that logic a little step further, why does this really matter? Because if you don't, Israel does not have the capability. Once everything is buried deep underground, it will not have the capability to take it out. That therefore means it subcontracts out to Washington its defense.
Or it goes faster.
Well, there's only two options, and that's what's driving this. One is to go ahead and take it out now, relatively speaking, the next several months, or to subcontract defense out to Washington. The risk of doing that from the perspective of Israel's decision makers is the United States said clearly, and Panetta said it, what the red line for the United States is not this problem of a threshold nuclear capability, which is Israel's problem. The problem is only when Iran decides explicitly that it will move to a nuclear bomb. And it's that which is tying this knot so tightly.
Israel can't live with that, what they would call a lesser standard of
Now, if you're
concern.
Iranian and you walk this back, what do you need to do over the next 2 or 3 months? You need to allow rigorous, credible inspections of Fordo. Once you do this, this knot that is so tightly tied begins to unravel.
Paul, if they did that, would that obviate the need for option one, which Janice just described, namely a sooner rather than later Israeli attack?
I'm sorry, if who did what?
If Iran allowed very vigorous and credible inspections sooner rather than later
At Fordo.
would that take, well, they're already doing it at Fordo, at other places as well, I guess, would that take that imminent attack by Israel off the table?
Well, it should, from the standpoint of precise logical thinking about strategy and military capabilities, which my fellow panelists have been discussing over the last few minutes, and I agree with it on those grounds. But there is a lot more politics and posturing to this than we are talking about. It was quite rightly said earlier in the discussion that we've got a timetable here that has to do with the Israeli anxiousness about what might happen over the next few months. Well, that has at least as much to do with perceptions of the U.S. electoral calendar and Barack Obama's vulnerability or lack of it as it does with any details of what's going on in Iran. I think this again speaks to the Iranian incentive to agree to something that we will consider intrusive inspection, and that would assure us and the rest of the P5+1 that there would not be some sort of breakout capability where on Monday the Iranians decide to break out and on Thursday they've got an operational bomb. That simply doesn't need to happen, and it won't happen if we have the kind of agreement that I'm alluding to.
Ali, you know, we have been framing this discussion so far as Iran versus Israel, Iran versus the West. What we haven't talked about yet is Iran versus its Sunni neighbors. And I wonder if they have a different red line from either of those other two groups we've been talking about so far.
Well, the leadership of the Islamic Republic has followed very, very unwise policies. Most unfortunately, the new leadership in Tehran, those Revolutionary Guards commanders who have risen to important positions, they have alienated all Arab neighbors of Iran to the degree that in WikiLeaks we read a Saudi king saying that you should cut off, the United States should cut off the head of the snake, of the Iranian snake, it means. So the isolation that we talked about in the beginning of the program, unfortunately, more or less is complete, and that is the fault and mistake of the leadership in Tehran. It is not others mistreating the regime in Tehran. It is the unwise policies and rhetorics and foreign policy behavior of the Islamic Republic, which has brought it to this stage. You should not forget that in 1980, such type of policies made it very, very convenient and easy for Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, and no one came to the aid of Iran. And most unfortunately, those Revolutionary Guards commanders who lost the war in 1988 have not learned a single lesson from that war, and they are imposing diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions and possibly bombardment of Iran's nuclear facilities upon the Iranian nation. Tehran is to blame, not others.
Ash, one thing we haven't discussed yet is, let me put that scenario that Janice Stein just put on the table to you. Israel doesn't do anything in the short run, but trusts the United States in the longer run to, if you like, subcontract out this military strike. And my question is, do you think Israeli leaders at the end of the day trust the Americans to do that if that's ultimately what the decision makers come down to?
Well, I think that's probably been the very nature of the discussions that have been taking place over the past several weeks between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama, and between various senior officials on both sides. And that is the question of how far is the United States willing to go to make a commitment to the Israeli government that it will do whatever is necessary at the end of the day to prevent Iran from acquiring this nuclear weapons capability. And I think at this point it's probably not been so clear-cut that the Israelis would trust or feel confident that they could rely on the United States to take that kind of action if it came to that. But this is something that both sides will be talking about certainly over the next several months. At the end of the day, it's probably unrealistic to expect that the president would emphatically and basically tell the Israelis what they're looking to hear. Whatever is going to come out of these discussions will leave some room for future options, and I think that's what's going to concern the Israelis the most.
And Paul, again, following up on sort of the notion of who wins in November, do the Israelis trust the Republican candidate more than the Democratic candidate to, if you like, subcontract out this job of reliability on a military strike?
They probably would, and I agree with Ash's basic point about distrust. which is one of the reasons why I would not rule out Israeli military action between now and the first Tuesday in November, depending on what Mr. Obama's re-election prospects look like as that date approaches. Basically, the political dynamic that took place earlier this year when Mr. Netanyahu and President Obama met was the Obama administration stated repeatedly and strongly that an Iranian nuclear weapon would be unacceptable. That was part of what they had to do to buy time from the Israelis. That is the sort of thing that if the negotiations stretch out without a particular agreement, and we get into 2013 and maybe even 2014, if Mr. Obama is reelected, then Benjamin Netanyahu will come back at him again and again saying, you said this was unacceptable, negotiations are not preventing it, what are you going to do about it? So it was basically a trade-off between the near term and the far term as far as U.S. dealings with Israel was concerned.
Austin, let me get your view on that. If it looks like Barack Obama is going to be reelected, does that encourage the Israelis, in your view, to do what I guess traditionally has been called some kind of October surprise?
I think to some extent it does, but even with a Republican president, I don't think the Israelis are going to be entirely comfortable that the U.S. will exercise a military option. People forget, George W. Bush had an opportunity to take military action against North Korea when they started to reprocess early in his presidency, and he didn't take military action to prevent the North Koreans. So a Mitt Romney that's halfway into his presidency looking at the potential for re-election, maybe the U.S. economy is getting better, but it's weak. Is he really going to take military action that could potentially destabilize the entire Middle East? I think no Israeli policymaker that believes military action might be necessary can go to bed 100% assured that even a Republican president will do that.
Janice?
It's interesting because often these things come down to intangibles, and there is a better personal relationship between Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Mitt Romney. They've known each other for a long time.
They're both Bain Capital guys.
That's right. They're both Bain Capital guys, and they've known each other. And sometimes there's greater confidence. I don't agree that an October surprise is likely if, in fact, it looks like Barack Obama will be elected. Because the calculus there is November the 5th or 6th or 7th. Israel has to deal with an absolutely enraged President Obama, because there's nothing that one would be more calculated to complicate his race for the presidency, and the United States may well be drawn in to some kind of confrontation were that to happen.
That would really be, if they were to do something in October, a
huge.
month before Election Day,
That is huge.
that would be
rolling
really
of the
thumbing
dice.
their nose at Obama, wouldn't
It
it?
really is, and it is the highest stakes poker than one can imagine, and I do not expect that in fact will happen.
Ali, do you want to come in on
The flip side
that?
of that, though.
All right, sir, go ahead. Austin, go ahead. Then
I was just going to comment that the flip side of that is the Israelis can rely on rock-solid congressional support. So even if a re-elected Obama is furious, there's going to be real upper bounds on how much he could take action to punish the Israelis. So I think you have to keep that in mind.
That's true, but the executive is the executive in crunch calls, especially on this issue. So it would be so risky.
Let me get Ali Alfoneh on this.
Mixed signals from Washington are always very, very dangerous and destructive because they are bound to be misunderstood in Tehran. On the one hand, the U.S. president and the Obama presidency is telling that all options are on the table and the U.S. is against the nuclear bomb possessed by Iran. On the other hand, you see all sorts of U.S. officials saying that they are not planning to use force against the Islamic Republic. And these type of signals are convincing the Islamic Republic that the U.S. in reality has not the stomach to use force against the Islamic Republic, and therefore they will continue the program as they have done until now. One issue which has been addressed earlier in this debate, unfortunately we did not have the opportunity to discuss it further, is the impact of the sanctions regime. No one discusses that Iran has possibly a foreign exchange reserve of $90 billion. Now, if Iran is really that close to getting the bomb, as some people assess, why should they not go all the way, now that there is no military pressure, no risk of U.S. intervention against Iran, and there is $90 billion in the foreign exchange reserve, which can be infused into the economy to keep the country running for, let's say, 1 to 2 years. And these factors are not discussed in our program.
Okay, just with 3 minutes to go here, I want to put one more thing on the table and get some quick views on this to make sure everybody gets a kick at it. The United States has been at war in Iraq for 10 years, in Afghanistan for 10 years. Is there anything, Paul, to you first, is there anything that could happen in Iran that would convince the American public that their military ought to get back on the horse and go off to battle yet again?
Well, American politicians exercising the bully pulpit can get the American people to go along with a lot of things, and the whole Iraq war experience demonstrates that. Nonetheless, the war fatigue to which you allude, Steve, is a major factor and certainly will bear heavily on the decision-making of whoever is elected president in November.
How about Ash, you on that same question?
Yeah, well, I think the fact is that the polls show broad support for a policy of prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability, and I believe some of those same polls suggest that there would be support for military action if necessary, if that were the only way to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon. So I think that there was quite a bit of room for developing the kind of public support that a president might need if he had to make this kind of difficult decision. This wouldn't be obviously a ground operation. This would be limited to military airstrikes, and quite different from the kind of wars we've seen certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Austin Long.
We're not there yet, and I think we have much more time to let this play out.
I don't have much more time to get everybody on this, so Austin Long, come on in here.
Sure, just briefly, I agree with Ash. I don't think you'll see support for major ground operations, but airstrikes, I think, are, you can potentially get support from the American people.
Ali, your view on that?
The U.S. should change the regime in Tehran, not treat the symptoms of an illness.
Well, that's not too provocative a thing to say with a minute left to go on the program. Okay, Janice, how about your view on...
Were Obama to receive incontrovertible, good, reliable, human intelligence that there was a decision by Iranians, by the top leadership, to go for a bomb, I think he would take action.
You think he would take action?
Yeah, even before the election.
Even a month before the election?
Yes. He has he has now made that commitment, and I don't think he could survive politically, because that intel, everybody leaks intelligence on one side or the other of this thing. And were that to emerge, I think he would take action.
Gotcha. I want to thank everybody for participating in tonight's program. Very interesting and very helpful in understanding what's going on in a very confusing part of the world. Ash Jain from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in Washington, D.C. Paul Pillar, the Center for Peace and Security Studies, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Ali Alfoneh, American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Austin Long, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University in New York City, and of course Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto here in our main studio. Thanks so much, everybody. We thank you for your participation tonight.